Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm PennLive opinion editor John Misick. We're being joined this afternoon by Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro. We'll spend the next 30 minutes or so talking about the grand jury report on child sexual abuse in the Roman Catholic Diocese in Pennsylvania. Mr. Shapiro, thanks for coming in. Appreciate the time.
I'm glad to be here, and I want to thank really PennLive for your commitment to covering this story. I know that in talking to the dozens of survivors that I've talked to, they have found great hope in your reporting and your willingness to cover this. So I want to thank you for that. That's one of the reasons why I'm here. I'm also here to talk more about really the most comprehensive report into clergy sex abuse and cover-up in the history of this country and probably the world. The 884-page report, which documented 301 predator priests, which showed a systematic cover-up by church leaders that really stretched all the way to the Vatican, and where grand jurors, 23 Pennsylvanians, worked tirelessly for 2 years, listening to gut-wrenching testimony, reviewing more than 500,000 pages of the church's own documents from their secret archives, not my word, but the term the church uses, in order to put forth this comprehensive grand jury report, which I hope leads to not only some healing for those survivors who, again, I know have been here and been covered by this news agency, but also leads to some real change here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So I'm happy to take your questions and talk about whatever's on your mind, with the obvious caveat that there are still some things I'm not permitted to talk about because there's some active litigation by petitioners who are still trying to stop the release of the full report. And certainly I continue to be bound by grand jury secrecy laws, but within those, within that construct, within those confines, I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. One of the things that we hear often from victims of child sex abuse from outside the realm of the Catholic Church is that child sex crimes happen everywhere, and in fact we know statistically that they do sometimes in higher prevalence. Why the focus on the church? Why the investigation on the church?
Well, respectfully, Evie, and I really truly mean respectfully, because your coverage has been brilliant. I think that is a false frame of the question. We have pursued child sexual abuse in a lot of other places as well, whether it's holding the administrators at Penn State accountable, whether it's arresting people in high-profile positions for preying on kids, whether it's the work we do day in and day out in the child predator unit, in public settings as well as private settings. We go after child predators. It is one of the core focuses of my office, not just the individuals who abuse kids, but those who cover it up as well, those who put the interests of their institution ahead of the interests of protecting kids. Certainly, the biggest investigation we've done, or at least that which has garnered the most attention, has been the investigation into clergy sex abuse. And I think any rational thinking human being would say it was the right thing to do to uncover this. And we need to make sure that there is more work to uncover this type of institutional abuse and cover-up. Reasons why in Pennsylvania I'm working so hard to protect our Grand Jury Act, the same act that opponents of ours over this last year and a half have tried to undermine and who are now actively trying to get the Supreme Court to overturn. The only reason we've been able to unearth this abuse and cover-up, as well as other examples of abuse and cover-up, is because of the Grand Jury Act and because of the latitude it gives us to hold these predators accountable, to hold the enablers accountable. We have got to protect this. Evie, I've heard from probably at this point 14 or 15 attorneys general from around the country who want to have similar investigations in their states into abuse within the Catholic Church. Many of them can't do it because they don't have the tools that we have in Pennsylvania through the Grand Jury Act to be able to hold big, powerful institutions accountable, which leaves it to maybe others in their respective states. Right now, I think the people of Pennsylvania want me and want other prosecutors to go out and hold powerful institutions accountable, not shield them from the reach of the law. And that is exactly what we did here in this clergy abuse case. It's what we're doing what we did in Penn State. It's what we're doing, though not with children, still involving sexual abuse, at the Lackawanna County Prison. And that is important work that we do day in and day out. And we need all the tools at our disposal to do that across the board.
Okay. Well, just to follow up on the case that is still pending before the Supreme Court, where those petitioners are trying to get the right to come back in and have parts of the report revised or eliminated, what have you. People have said that case has the potential to, impose through the court changes on the grand jury process as we know it, whether that would be striking down parts of the Grand Jury Act, I guess, or maybe the court just imposing new rules on how grand jury reports are formulated going forward. And I was curious to ask you, I know you're obviously fighting for the sanctity of the report as delivered by the grand jury process here, but if you can step back and take a larger view of this, do you feel like the grand jury process in Pennsylvania needs some tweaking, and how could it be improved, and specifically on the report side of it?
Just to be clear, I'm fighting to make sure that every single survivor's truth is told. Mm-hmm. None of them should be redacted. No one survivor's truth is less important than another. So my primary focus, when we go to court on September the 26th for oral argument before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, is to have a full unredacted report be released. Understand that the petitioners are fighting to block that, and they're fighting to try to undermine or do away with the Grand Jury Act, an act that is critical to unearthing the truth that big institutions want to cover up, want to hide, whether it's organized crime or public corruption or the type of widespread, large-scale, systematic cover-up and abuse that we saw here in the Catholic Church. All Pennsylvanians should be concerned that these petitioners might succeed at undermining the Grand Jury Act, and thus making it harder for Pennsylvanians to know the truth about what's happening in big institutions or what's happening in their government. The Grand Jury Act permits me the ability, as the Attorney General, and DAs for that matter, to write reports, unearth the type of secret horrors that we were able to unearth here, and make recommendations to lawmakers for change. Ultimately, it's up to them as to whether or not they want to adopt the change, like, for example, these 4 recommendations contained in the grand jury report. But ironically, as I pointed out to Evie, right now you have state attorneys general begging their legislature for the authority that we have in Pennsylvania so they can do one of these reports, while you've got forces in Pennsylvania that are trying to take away our tools to uncover this type of corruption. I'll be arguing, our team will be arguing with all of our force to protect the Grand Jury Act and ensure that the truth is shared for every single one of these survivors.
I wanted to ask about the idea of a reparations fund, which seemed to get a lot of conversation in Harrisburg last week. Senate President Scarnati said it would be a good idea. In the Harrisburg diocese and a couple of the other dioceses seemed to indicate support, or at least willingness to explore the possibility. What do you think about the idea of a reparations fund?
Ron, I'm for all 4 grand jury recommendations, period.
I mean, it's more important to focus on expanding the statute of limitation and providing the window.
I'm for all 4 recommendations. The grand jury heard 2 years worth of gut-wrenching testimony, reviewed 500,000 pages from the church's own records, wrote an 884-page report. And based on all of that information, based on all the testimony, based on all the documents, they felt that these 4 reforms were needed to prevent this type of widespread abuse and cover-up from ever happening again. I stand with the grand jurors. I stand with the survivors. I'm for each and every one of these 4 recommendations.
We're hearing your office has gotten hundreds of leads since the report came out. What are you doing with those leads? Are you dealing with them? Are they going to the district attorneys in respective counties? How are follow-ups being handled?
Great question, Kate. And I can share some news with you here today that heretofore we've not shared. Our hotline has received 933 calls in the 3 weeks since the grand jury report was released. And let me put that into some context for you, Kate. We all know that when there is some sort of an arrest or report or something like that of child sexual abuse, and hotlines are set up, even if one has not been abused at the hands of those who were the subject to the arrest or the subject to the report, it tends to increase call volume. It tends to increase activity in victims' crisis centers, for example. So following the Altoona Johnstown report, in the 2 years post Altoona Johnstown, our clergy abuse hotline received just over 300 calls. 2 years, about 300 calls. Here, in 3 weeks since this grand jury report, we've received 933 calls. Now, the question you ask is, what are we doing with those calls? Each and every one of those calls are being handled by one of our specially trained agents, typically from our child predator unit. We then make a determination based on the call, based on the conversation that we've had, what warrants further investigation. Beyond that, Kate, I respectfully, and I hope you'll understand, I'm not going to get into the specifics of who's calling and what they're saying. I can tell you that there are a number of calls that have greatly interest to us, and that we are following up as appropriate, and that we are coordinating with our law enforcement partners at all levels to ensure that every single one of these calls is handled in the most effective manner possible.
Just a housekeeping note to our interrogators. The Facebook audience has complained that they can't hear us, so just speak a little bit more loudly and clearly. They can hear you just fine.
I'll try to repeat the question.
Fair enough. All right. Let me just follow up on that real quickly. So you can't say if you've heard any of these new complaints?
I won't say.
Just following up on that, though, have you, in terms of staffing to take all these calls, so it's such a big number of calls, has it been a challenge to have enough staff to handle and process these calls?
Yes, our team has done an extraordinary job. We've pulled people off of other matters. We've pulled people out of our child predator unit to handle it, all at the direction of our Executive Deputy Attorney General, Jennifer Selber. And so we wanted to make sure that there wasn't just a warm, friendly voice, on the other end of the call, which of course there would be, but that there were specially trained individuals who could handle the kinds of calls that we're getting. And our team has stepped up. I am, if you'll permit me, Ron, for a moment, I'm just so unbelievably proud of our team. From Jen Selber to our first deputy, Michelle Henry, Dan Dye, our lead prosecutor, to the dozens of agents and lawyers who worked on this. They really poured their hearts into this and their souls into it, and they're making a real difference. And to see, for me to be able to have the chance to work with them is an honor. For me to see the survivors interact with them and feel the warmth that the survivors feel toward them as a result of their work is really special. And they don't get to be on camera. They don't get to be the ones up front, but they deserve so much credit. And I credit them every opportunity I get. They're really extraordinary people, and one of the greatest honors of this job is to have the chance to work with them.
I want to ask you to put on your former State House member hat for a moment, if I could. I mean, the argument that we've been hearing against statute of limitations reform is that it violates the remedies clause in the Constitution, and were that to pass that, it could come to a court challenge and then be bounced. But the legislature routinely passes statutes that come to legal challenge. Sometimes they're shot down, sometimes they're not. I wonder what you make of that constitutional argument.
Sure, and just to be very, very clear here and precise, the statute of limitations reform that the grand jury recommended is that there should be no criminal statute of limitations for child sexual abuse. 41 other states, actually, let me be clear, 39 other states, Guam and the District of Columbia, so 41 jurisdictions, have done away with the statute of limitations on the criminal side. Understand that we have a limitation on the amount of time I can bring a criminal case. So just to focus on these 301 predator priests, those who are alive, we ran each and every one of them through a statute of limitations test. And here in Pennsylvania, because of our laws, we were only able to charge 2 of them. Now, one has already pled guilty, but we were only able to charge 2. If I was the Attorney General in another one of those jurisdictions, one of those 41 jurisdictions, I could have charged each and every one. A victim, John, his name is Bob from Bethlehem, who is 83 years old. You know, I sat with him in his backyard and listened to his story of abuse when he was just 11 or 12 years old. He's had to carry that abuse around for 70 years of his life. He was married for about 50 years. His wife never knew that he was abused at the hands of a priest. He carried that around for so long and had to go through counseling and therapy and all the things that he had to go through. Surely he is entitled to some sort of compensation from the church to pay for that. The thing that I find most remarkable about these survivors who continue to inspire me is that not one has ever asked for $1. Not one has ever asked for money. They're not motivated by money. They're motivated by holding the people who did this to them accountable. And so to that end, the grand jury thought it was important that there be a civil window opened up for a period of 2 years to allow these individuals to seek that type of compensation to help them with the care that they have needed. And I realize that there are some in the legislature who have tried to throw up this argument that it's unconstitutional. Let me be very clear, and I speak for the Office of Attorney General, and this is our position. It is constitutional. There is nothing in state Supreme Court precedent that suggests that the remedies clause could not be used to provide for compensation through a civil window for these survivors. And anyone who suggests otherwise is wrong on the law, period. I will be communicating more formally to the legislature the legal position of this office. But anyone who is a student of law who's actually looked at this carefully and studied precedent and studied case law and studied United States Supreme Court precedent, where they have made it clear that state lawmakers in these types of situations can pass civil windows, anyone who's looked at it critically and carefully should arrive at the same conclusion. Furthermore, I don't know how any responsible lawmaker can read these 884 pages, can listen to the victims in their communities, in their districts, and vote against the 4 recommendations put forth by the grand jury. I just don't know how they can do that. And that's ultimately, I think, where this needs to go. A straight vote, up or down, on these 4 recommendations. And if that opportunity presents itself to the 50 senators and the 203 representatives, I'm confident that they will do the right thing. And Governor Wolf has already indicated that he stands on the side of the grand jurors, and he wants those 4 recommendations without amendment to reach his desk.
When you noted that you did a statute of limitations test criminally for all the 301 predator priests, and you found 2 that fit within the statute of limitations and could be prosecuted, I was curious. I don't know if I don't know if you've thought about it like this, but do you feel could it be said that says something about how that institution, the church, is handling these cases now? Does it suggest that they've cleaned up their act a lot in terms of how they're dealing with cases that come to them today or next week?
I think, respectfully, you're mixing apples and oranges here. And let me try to address both sides of your question. The reason I couldn't charge more than 2 is because our laws are weak in Pennsylvania when it comes to the criminal statute of limitations, and it's why the grand jurors called for eliminating the statute of limitations as the other 41 states have, period. Now you're asking a question is, well, hasn't this sort of been dealt with already? Doesn't it mean that today things are okay? Is that essentially what you're saying? Yeah,
because I'm thinking about it with the cutoff being 30 now for somebody for a law enforcement agency to pursue charges, right?
Right. Well, here's why. Does
that mean that for kids who are coming through the system now that they could be assured that things are safer?
Okay. I don't think that is based on what I've seen, based on what I continue to see, that is not a conclusion that I would draw, Charlie. Second, understand that
we didn't just run a statute of limitations test on the predator priests. We ran a statute of limitations test on the people who covered up the abuse as well. And we couldn't charge them either. Generally speaking, the statute of limitations on those kinds of crimes is 5 years. Many of those enablers, many of those people who covered it up, are still in active ministry and in positions of leadership within the church here in Pennsylvania and now across the country.
Yeah. But you get where I'm coming from. I mean, what I was thinking about there was that if you have a 5-year window to look at enabling, could that suggest that there just aren't that many cases in the last 5 years?
I did answer your question. I think that's a conclusion based on what I know that I would not draw.
Okay.
Attorney General, can you talk about the pushback from the Diocese of Harrisburg and Greensburg?
Well, it's ironic that the Diocese of Greensburg and Harrisburg have pushed back the way they are, since, as court records show, and as you reported, Evie, they went to court to stop our investigation. They went to court to stop the release of the grand jury report. And then they say in the media recently, the exact opposite, yet their own court records prove otherwise. Understand what happened here in Harrisburg and Greensburg as well as the other dioceses. Predator priests abused children, some as young as 18 months old. Then the church leaders covered it up. And they covered it up systematically so that they could shield these predators from the arm of the law. Back to Charlie's question. So they could shield them until after the statute of limitations had run. Then these dioceses go into court when someone, the Office of Attorney General, starts to look into it. Because we're not afraid of big, powerful institutions. We take them head on. We start to look at it. They go to court to stop our investigation. And then when they failed at being able to stop us, because we're unwilling to back down from them, they go to court to try and stop the release of the report. That is the ultimate, I'll use a term my mother would say, that's the ultimate chutzpah. I mean, to think about that. They knew about the abuse. They enabled it. They covered it up. When law enforcement finally went after them to look at it, they tried to stop our investigation, and then they tried to stop the release of the report. So I don't have a whole lot of patience for the rhetoric that they espouse now when I know that just a few months ago they were in court trying to stop it, so that you, Evie, and the public would have never known what we unearthed if they were successful. Think about that for a second. If they were successful in court, if we didn't fight back, the public would have never known the atrocities that occurred here in Pennsylvania.
What kind of contact or interaction have you had with either diocese since the report came out?
Me personally, I've read their press statements.
You've alleged that the Vatican has some knowledge.
I have to stop you. And for those of you in here, John said, you've alleged that the Vatican ... I haven't alleged anything. The grand jury found, through the church's own documents, that the Vatican knew about the predator priests, some predator priests, and some of the cover-up. But now you can continue with your question. This is not Josh Shapiro alleging something. This is the grand jury's findings.
All right. With that stipulated, how far up do you believe this goes? Does this go to the papal see itself? Do you believe Pope Francis knew about this? Do you believe the Pope failed to act in some way?
I think that's a fair question, but I also recognize my role as a prosecutor, which is to focus on the facts and the evidence and apply the law. The facts and the evidence that I have that is contained in the grand jury report, based on the grand jury investigation and an examination of the church's secret archives, is that the Vatican was informed of some of the abuse and the cover-up. What happened when it reached the Vatican, John, I don't know. And I'm not going to pretend to know, nor am I going to jump to any conclusions about whether the Pope knew or he didn't know. And I've been very consistent in my statements there about. That's really more of a question for the Vatican to better understand what happened when they received those documents and what they did with it. I don't have records of that, and so I'm not going to pretend that I have the answers on that.
I wanted to just see if you could shed a little more light on one of the facts that came out of the press conference. That you mentioned then that, just looking at my notes here, that the grand jury, I believe, heard complaints or credible allegations against more than 400 priests.
Yeah.
You wound up with a report that cited 301 priests. Could you speak about what kind of threshold you used to take that initial pool down to 300?
Sure. Well, the grand jury received a lot of information, both from testimony as well as from the church's own secret archives. And again, let me stress, the word secret archive is not my word. That's the church's term that they use for this locked up box of documents that detailed this horrific abuse and cover-up. Just because someone was alleged to have abused a child didn't mean that they automatically were named in the report. We tried as best as we could to corroborate that allegation, both with the church's documents as well as with testimony, and where we could corroborate it, then it was listed. The grand jury felt that it was important to only name the names where they could have corroborating evidence and corroborating facts to bolster some allegation. And so they were trying to be conservative, if you will, in terms of who they named. And I think that was the right approach. And, you know, as the grand jury pointed out, they had received information on more than 400 priests, listed 301 predator priests, and they received information on over 1,000 victims, but they believe that the real number is in the thousands. Those are the words of the grand jury.
Was there can you be any more specific on the types of corroboration that would have qualified to meet your test to get a priest's name?
Well, I think I was about as specific as I'm going to be. It was based on the church's own documents and records, and it was based on the testimony in the grand jury. And beyond that, I'm not going to get into the inner workings of our grand jury.
You mentioned before about the fact that this is an ongoing investigation and the problems and challenges of the statute of limitation. I was just wondering, is there any possibility of charges being filed for even things like an ongoing, continuing conspiracy, or even a conspiracy to obstruct justice, since, as you've talked about, it's not just the acts that happened, but the cover-up that's stretched for decades and that's continuing to this day. Is there any chance that there could be other conspiracy-type charges?
Ron, I think that's a good question and a fair question, but I never comment on what charges may or may not come in the future, or what we may or may not do in an investigation. All I can say is that it is ongoing. And as I said in response to Kate's question before about our hotline, we've received 933 calls, and we are, reviewing each and every one of them to determine the appropriate next steps.
This was years in the making, lots of staff involved. Can you put a ballpark price tag on the cost of this investigation?
I really can't, not because I'm unwilling to, but because we really just haven't drilled down that way. What I can tell you is that when I took office, this is a grand jury investigation. I didn't know anything about it when I was running. And when I took office, in the first few days when I was briefed on this, really had the choice to sort of sideline this and not go forward, or to go forward. And not only did I feel like it was important to go forward, I felt that it was important to put a lot more resources into the investigation. Under Jennifer Selber's leadership, we put a number of agents and lawyers on it from a number of different areas within our office. We didn't really rely on any outside counsel or any outside assistance. It was all done internally, and so these are people who are already being paid a salary and already coming to work. I made the call as the Attorney General that when they came to work, they should be working on this. So there's not really an added cost to the taxpayers. It's just that it was my determination made to focus the attention on these public servants on this issue.
To that end, then, can you say how many bodies were working on this at
I would say easily over 50 people were involved, 50, in one form or another.
This
probably has been asked, so maybe I'll just rephrase it. We know the investigation is ongoing. Should we expect some major shoes to drop going forward?
I really don't think it would be prudent for me to comment on that. There are a couple important timelines ahead that I can talk about. One is the legislature is back for a limited session this fall. Leader Reed and Leader Corman have indicated publicly that this would be an issue under consideration in both the House and the Senate. So that's an important date or dates to keep in mind. A critically important date is September the 26th, when we'll have oral argument before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, both to make sure that a full report is released and all the redactions are eliminated, and importantly, and I truly hope this editorial board appreciates the gravity of the issues presented to the Supreme Court. The opponents of this report, the petitioners who have gone to court to try to stop its release, are now trying to end the Grand Jury Act as we know it and make it nearly impossible for the Attorney General, myself, and whoever in the future, make it impossible to be able to do these types of investigations, which means the public will learn less about public corruption and organized crime and systematic cover-ups like this. That is not what the people of Pennsylvania want, clearly. But that's a really critical issue that's coming forth, and that'll be on September 26th. Beyond that, I think it would be imprudent for me to comment on what may or may not come in the future.
Great. All right, Attorney General Josh Shapiro, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Appreciate the time.
Thank you.